lustig ist auch unser Leben feiert, man tut uns so essen.
Welcome to the 17th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, Liberators of the Holocaust, the Satellite Camps. Adolf Hitler's final solution was carried out in an estimated 44,000 concentration camps, ghettos, and forced labor camps spread out throughout Europe. An estimated 15 to 20 million people were murdered in these camps, including 6 million Jews. For the young American GIs who liberated them, the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps far outweighed anything they had experienced in war. Alex Bourdas liberated an auxiliary camp that had housed 20,000 POWs. Their bodies were now stacked on carts and covered with lime to cut down the odor. Tom Carr entered a small camp, the name of which he could not remember, but he could never forget the emaciated prisoners still housed in the cells or the bodies stacked in piles outside. General Patton himself sent down orders for his personnel to see what they were fighting for and against by visiting a small concentration camp near Erfurt, Germany. Mark Wilson recalled the few survivors they found there walked around in a daze, looking more like living skeletons. In 1997, more than 50 years after the war had ended, Charles Savage returned to Marienbad, Czechoslovakia. Accompanied by a local historian, Savage searched for the remains of Flashenhutten, the small camp that Savage had helped liberate and the mass burial site that had shocked him. These stories and more in this 17th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, Part 3 of the Liberators of the Holocaust episodes. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only in democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites that we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes that I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. The Nazis used 22 main concentration camps, along with an estimated 1,200 auxiliary camps, to murder the 15 to 20 million people who perished in the Holocaust. American GIs liberated many of the auxiliary camps. Alex Bourdas of Kinston, North Carolina, recalled liberating an auxiliary camp that was housed in what had been an aluminum factory in Ranshofen, Austria.
As we approached the factory, we began to pick up the stench of something very unpleasant, which we assumed it to be the smell of decaying bodies. We found the evidence in the yard behind the factory. There were piles of dead POWs placed crossways on carts and covered with lime to cut down the odor until they could be buried. There could easily be 100 bodies on each of those carts. There is no way you could possibly recognize anyone. It was learned that 20,000 POWs were held there. There was a mixed bag of POWs. Some were Americans, some British, French, and you name it. There was just a lot of mixed aliens who couldn't understand one another. only the English-speaking. Most of the camp guards had switched clothing and took off. However, we did find a few. The POWs helped with this chore. Some of the POWs wanted us to use our weapons and go after the guards who escaped. They would recognize them in or out of the uniform, but we couldn't let them have our weapons for a number of reasons.
Shortly after liberating the camp at Ranshofen and capturing the German city of Braunau am Inn, the birthplace of Hitler, an SS commander sent word that his troops were ready to surrender. The war was in its final days, and the German troops preferred surrendering to the Americans than to the Russians.
We moved in on them in battle formation and accepted their surrender. At one location there were 6,000 German troops. They had neatly piled all their equipment and stacked their rifles, their ammo, their grenades, their auto weapons, and explosives in piles. Our other locations were the same.
Many of the SS POWs were housed in the very same aluminum factory that had previously been used as a concentration camp. The Americans treated the German POWs far better than the SS had treated the concentration camp prisoners. The name of the concentration camp he liberated may have escaped Tom Carr of Merrick, New York, but the nightmarish memory of it never could.
I was the first American to enter a small concentration camp, I don't remember where, closed in by a tall stockaded fence. Emaciated people in cells and logs, piled crisscross with bodies on top and 5-gallon terry cans of gasoline at the ready for burning. Fortunately, the German captors left hurriedly before we got there. When asked, the nearby residents how they were not able to smell the awful stench, they said they thought it was some kind of soap factory.
The Ohrdruf concentration camp had opened as a satellite of nearby Buchenwald in November 1944. The camp supplied forced labor for railway construction for a proposed communication center that was never built due to the Allied advance. By March 1945, Ohrdruf had a prisoner population of over 10,000. Due to the advancing U.S. forces, the SS began evacuating prisoners on a death march to Buchenwald the following month. Those who were too ill to march were executed at the camp. When American GIs liberated the camp in early April 1945, April 4th to be exact, they discovered the decomposing remains of hundreds of murdered prisoners, as well as a few surviving prisoners who were all starving, emaciated, and in need of medical attention. Ohrdruf was the first concentration camp liberated by American soldiers, approximately a week before Nordhausen and Buchenwald were liberated. But unlike the other camps, at Ohrdruf they found fewer than 75 people still alive. Upon receiving reports of the Nazi crimes committed at Ohrdruf, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, decided to visit the camp himself on April 12th, accompanied by Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley. Later, General Eisenhower sent a cable to General George C. Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, describing their visit to Ohrdruf.
The most interesting, although horrible, sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The thing I saw beggars description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality was so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men, killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations were merely propaganda.
General Eisenhower wanted the world to see what had happened in the concentration camps. He cabled General Marshall, requesting that a congressional delegation as well as journalists be sent to the liberated concentration camps so that the world would never forget what happened in them. In his cable, General Eisenhower wrote,
"We continue to uncover German concentration camps for political prisoners in which conditions of indescribable horror prevail. I have visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been an understatement. If you could see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit to this theater in a couple of C-54s, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps. I am hopeful that some British individuals in similar categories will visit the northern area to witness similar evidence of atrocities."
President Harry S. Truman and Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson gave General Marshall immediate permission for the requested delegations to visit the camps. General Eisenhower also insisted that local German residents be taken to the camps so that they could no longer pretend not to know what had happened within them. Ohrdruf made such a powerful impression on General George S. Patton as well. He described it as
"one of the most appalling sights I have ever seen."
He recounted in his diary that
"in a shed was a pile of about 40 completely naked human bodies in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purposes of destroying them, but for the purposes of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be about 200. The bodies were taken to a pit a mile from the camp, where they were buried. The inmates claimed that 3,000 men who had been either shot in the head or who had died of starvation had been so buried since the 1st of January. When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it was expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore, they had some of the slaves exhumed the bodies and placed them on a mammoth griddle, composed of 60-centimeter railway tracks laid on brick foundations. They poured pitch on the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal under them. They were not very successful in their operations because there was a pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds."
Following General Eisenhower's lead, General Patton wanted as many of the soldiers under his command to visit the concentration camp as possible. Mark D. Wilson of Clarksburg, West Virginia, had landed in the 5th Wave on Omaha Beach and had then fought his way with the infantry on to Paris, Belgium, and into the German crossing, the Siegfried Line. In early April 1945, Wilson was with the 80th Infantry Division in Erfurt, Germany, when it liberated the concentration camp in the nearby town of Ohrdruf. Wilson remembered,
"General Patton sent down orders to send personnel to view the camp and to see what we were fighting for and against, the savage inhumanity of the Nazis. I was selected to go from our company, and I saw firsthand. There were bodies stacked up and sprinkled with lime, piles of burned bodies. Some appeared to have been burned alive, a crematorium, and the few living walking around slowly and in a daze. They looked like walking skeletons. The army had commandeered German civilians from Erfurt to dig the graves."
While Theresienstadt, near Terezin, was the main Nazi concentration camp in Czechoslovakia during World War II, a network of smaller camps associated with Flossenburg, Ravensbrück, and Grossrausen were also located in Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland region, which was annexed by Nazi Germany after the 1938 Munich Agreement. While Nazi propaganda claimed that some of these camps, such as Theresienstadt, were spa camps where elderly Jews could retire, they were in fact forced labor ghetto camps and also served as transit assembly camps where Jews were gathered en route to death camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka. Approximately 140,000 Jews were transferred to the so-called spa town of Theresienstadt during its 3.5 years of existence. Nearly 90,000 of them were deported to the death camps further east. Roughly 33,000 died at Theresienstadt itself. 90,000 of the 15,000 children sent there were murdered. Still, the Nazi propaganda machine managed to fool the International Red Cross, which visited the camp in June 1944 by intensifying deportations just prior to the visit to reduce overcrowding, planting gardens, painting barracks, and forcing the Jewish captives to perform music for the visiting dignitaries. The historic spa town of Marienbad, Czechoslovakia, was largely untouched by World War II. A satellite camp of Flossenburg, Nirolau concentration camp, was located just outside of Marienbad. Primarily a camp for women, Nirolau supplied forced labor for a nearby porcelain factory. Charles Savage of East Smithfield, Pennsylvania, recalled another subcamp which was largely forgotten just outside of Marienbad, near the small village of Skler. Savage was assigned to the camp he remembered as Flashenhutten. While at the camp, Savage found a horrific mass grave straight out of his worst nightmares. During the 1990s, Savage returned to the Czech Republic numerous times, each time with the mission of finding the then-forgotten concentration camp. During one trip in 1997, Savage spent 3 days with a local Czech historian who thought he had found the location of the camp. The historian was soon disappointed.
The minute I walked through the area, I knew this was not the place. He was very upset when I told him that he was wrong, that this was not the place. For 2 days he fumed and was quite distressed. I even drew him a map of the camp from my memory, locating all the buildings, the gates, the roads, the towers, the minefields, and I even drew the compass directions, north, east, south, west. He was impressed, but he was not convinced.
On the last day of his visit with the historian, as they started their drive back to Pilsen, they drove through an area they had not been to before. Suddenly, Savage got an eerie feeling, and he insisted the historian stop the car.
I got out, and I walked to an open field with few trees, and there it was. I was able to show him where the main gate had been, the minefield across from the gate, the towers. We found the foundations of all the buildings. I showed him where the mass grave had been, and we could see a slight depression in that area. Both of us were overwhelmed. I was so emotionally spent that I cried.
Afterwards, a weary Savage, along with his historian friend, visited the closest museum, located in Marienbad. Both were disappointed to find
they had nothing about our being there in 1945, and they knew nothing about the camp.
Savage donated his pictures to the concentration camp to the museum.
The director of the museum was elated. I became a hero again. Needless to say that we did not continue our trip back to Pilsen. I answered questions for hours. They took several aerial photos of the camp area at the end of October, after a heavy frost had eliminated the foliage. I haven't seen the photos yet, but I'm told that all the foundations of the buildings are very plain once you know what you're looking for.
Savage's last mission, one of remembrance and commemoration, had finally been achieved. The Genocide Convention of 1948 codified genocide as an international crime, defining it as an act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Those acts include killings, inflicting serious harm on a group, making its living conditions impossible, preventing births within the group, or forcibly transferring children to another group. The Holocaust was not the first genocide in history, or even the first in the 20th century. The Armenian genocide took place from 1915 to 1918, and the Ukraine from 1932 to 33. We remember the Holocaust in part to honor its victims, but also to ensure that it never happens again. And yet we've had genocides occur in the years following the Holocaust. Cambodia, 1975 to 79, Bosnia, 1992 to 1995, Rwanda, 1994, Sudan, 2004 to the present, and the Ukraine, 2022 to the present. Amnesty International has concluded that Israel's actions in Gaza can also be considered genocide. Yet the Holocaust remains unique, both in its sheer number of victims and in the industrialized assembly line murders it committed. Throughout 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers produced 4,000 to 5,000 corpses an hour. In one day, Auschwitz-Birkenau murdered as many people as live in the city I live in, Rockford, Illinois, the fifth largest city in Illinois. Gone in one day. Unbelievable. The sheer number of victims of the Holocaust seems unfathomable. Over 6 million Jewish people murdered, 2.7 million Jews killed in the death camps, another 2 million in mass shootings and massacres, another million killed in ghettos and forced labor camps through starvation, torture, and deprivation, and 250,000 murdered outside the camps and ghettos by anti-Semitic acts of violence or forced marches and boxcar deportations. But the Jews weren't the only targets of the Holocaust. 3.3 million Soviet POWs were murdered, 1.8 million non-Jewish ethnic Poles, as many as 500,000 Romani men, women, and children, 250,000 to 300,000 people with disabilities, and tens of thousands of political dissidents, thousands of gay men, at least 1,700 pacifists, and hundreds of black people. So many numbers. The scale is hard to comprehend. Yet each number represents a human being, a soul whose bright light was extinguished too soon, never given the chance to fully shine. Who knows how many humanitarians, geniuses were lost in the Holocaust? Perhaps the doctor who might have had the cure for cancer. We will never know. During my service in the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my wife and I visited the site of the Wannsee Conference, where senior government officials of Nazi Germany met to plan their final solution to implement the Holocaust. We visited the topography of terror, where the SS was headquartered and where political prisoners were mercilessly tortured and executed. We walked the hollowed, tortured grounds of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz concentration camps. My wife and I visited Auschwitz separately, not wanting to take our young children to the site where so many children had been murdered. I wouldn't recommend visiting by yourself at Auschwitz, like we did. It's too hard. Gymnasium-sized room after room filled with eyeglasses, artificial limbs, human hair, suitcases, and hardest of all, a gymnasium-sized room filled with stuffed animals and toys taken from children that were marched straight from the boxcars to the gas chambers. Overcome with emotion, I sat in the corner and I cried. I've also visited Wounded Knee, where U.S. cavalry men murdered nearly 300 Lakota men, women, and children, nearly all of whom were disarmed. They were buried in a mass grave, barely recognized by the United States government. Certainly, what happened to the Native Americans was a genocide. I also could easily have become one of the first victims of the Rwandan genocide when I visited in 1991 and was detained by government officials after I foolishly took a picture of the presidential palace. I was accused of being a Tutsi rebel sympathizer from Uganda plotting to kill the president, and I may never have been released had it not been for a quick-thinking U.S. diplomat named Larry Rector, who heard an American had been abducted. Many years later, my wife and I returned to Rwanda in 2017. Together we visited the Kigali Genocide Museum, remembering the nearly 1 million people killed by the Hutu extremist-led government, which launched a plan to wipe out the country's entire Tutsi minority and any others who opposed their policies. In just 100 days in 1994, 1 million people were killed, most often with machetes, many times by their neighbors. No place was safe, not even churches. A missionary at the time said, "There are no devils left in hell. They are all in Rwanda now." 400 people were killed each hour, 10,000 per day. Children were forced to participate. Neighbors turned on neighbors, friends on friends, teachers turned on their students, and priests on their congregations. The Rwandan genocide may have lacked the industrial scale and assembly line killing of the Holocaust, but in ruthless brutality and total percentage of the population that participated, it had few equals. Perhaps World War II veteran D. Eberhardt of Ellensburg, Washington, who liberated Dachau, said it best. "Only a thin veneer of civilization, probably not original, covers the seething hatreds and potential for brutality beneath. As we know from the events of this century alone, it doesn't take much to loose the demons. Because of the danger of the abyss opening, it seems to me that all of us need to be on guard against hatred and vilification of others. We need to do good deeds, and especially do what you're doing, teach true history and important values to the young." If we are to break the cycle of genocide after genocide, we would do well to live by the words of Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor who spent 7 years of Nazi rule and concentration camps as a dissident, most of his imprisonment at Dachau concentration camp. Niemöller wasn't perfect. None of us are. He's been criticized for the anti-Semitic beliefs he held early in his life. But he publicly acknowledged his moral failures, as well as the moral failures of the church he was a part of in stopping the Holocaust. And he left us with a stark warning that we should all live by today. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." To stop future genocides from occurring, we must always be on guard against hate, in whatever form it takes. When we hear others, especially our leaders, vilify minorities, be they Jews, blacks, Asians, LGBT, or yes, immigrants, we would do well to remember the logical progression of where such hate will lead. If I need to remind you, straight to the gas chambers. In my own country today, to stop future genocides from occurring, we must always be on guard against hate in whatever form it takes. When we hear others, especially those we elect as our leaders, vilify minorities, be they Jews, blacks, Asians, LGBT, or yes, immigrants, we would do well to remember the logical progression of where such hate will lead. If I need to remind you, straight to the gas chambers. In my own country today, in the United States, the country that fought against Nazi Germany, we are vilifying immigrants, denying them their basic rights, and sending them to prisons in foreign lands. We don't show their photographs on television because we don't want to recognize them as human beings. If we don't stand up for them, what group will be next? Who will stand for us when our time comes? Hate is a powerful, evil drug. There will always be morally repugnant, weak politicians who embrace it because people are easily led by it. But we must resist hate in whatever form it is used in, at whichever group it is directed towards. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Holocaust is that we must learn to love one another and that all living beings deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. In my mind, that's humans as well as animals. Let your soul shine and never forget the victims of the Holocaust as well as other genocides. We owe them that much.
Man tut uns zu essen geben Freistaat, wie lustig ist in den grünen.
Our song today, Flashenhutten, was written by a cobbler named Shaul Flashenhutten. While imprisoned at Sobibor in Poland, Flashenhutten refused an order to beat other prisoners. As a result, he was beaten by the Nazi commandant and ordered to compose a song praising the camp's living conditions. Although Flashenhutten was forced to include lyrics such as "Our life is happy here, we receive food, how happy it is in the green forest where I stay," the song's title, Flashenhutten, was a disguised Yiddish expletive to the Nazi guards. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network that you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. Be sure to check out our website for additional information about the veterans discussed in this episode, as well as pictures of the camps and of the veterans. New episodes come out weekly. Be sure to tell your friends. And you can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Until next time, thank you for remembering the victims of the Holocaust and our World War II veterans.